So, sir, on that basis, I'm happy to commend this bill to the House. Why waste 10 minutes?
Order. I'm calling Clare Curran. Clare Curran.
Well, I have to say, what a disappointing contribution. I was going to give that member over there some credit for chairing the Select Committee, the Commerce Select Committee, around the Construction Contracts Amendment Bill, which he did chair the Select Committee. But can I remind him that when that bill went back to the House from that committee, it did not include the retention scheme in it. It was Clayton Cosgrove who put an SOP on the table at committee stage for a retention scheme. And it was the Labor Party that pushed the retention scheme, put an SOP on the table, and then we had an election, and then the minister saw the light and actually included an SOP, put in his own SOP to the committee stage of the House, which included a retention scheme. So, history lesson, Mr. Young, history lesson. Go and maybe you weren't paying enough attention, because the Labor members were paying attention. It was the Labor members that pushed for a retention scheme. It was Craig Foss, who was the Commerce Minister at the time, who said, oh, no, we need to do a lot more work on that, and oh yes, we'll have a think about it. And he saw the light and felt the pressure from the construction industry, not to mention the fact that Jenny Shipley was one of the directors of Mainzeal, which was the construction company that collapsed in 2013 and came under huge scrutiny for an industry that was so badly managed, when these lead contract firms could go bust, $153 million owing, and none of the subcontractors being paid out. Absolute disgrace. Jenny Shipley was part of an inquiry into how that collapse happened. Former National Prime Minister, and the Commerce Minister at the time could not even bring himself to include a retention scheme, despite the advice that was coming at him, but despite the pleas of the construction industry to protect them, all those subcontractors down the line. Anyway, this is the closing, hopefully, Mr. Speaker, this is the closing chapter of that sorry chapter in our history. It's taken 4 years, at least 4 years, for it to be enacted, and the reason why we're passing this bill today in the House, before we could have waited another month at least, but because of that clause 138 in the Commercial Matters Bill, which is one of the 3 bills that's been put together in this third reading, which requires this new retention scheme to be enacted from the 31st of March, which is the end of next week. And that new retention scheme was amended at this Select Committee under the now Commerce Select Committee to include 2 instruments for the retention of those monies. One is for the retention money to be held in cash or liquid assets that can be easily converted into cash, and the second mechanism is for bonds or insurance, a mechanism such as insurance or bonds. So those. It's quite historic, it's important, we absolutely support it. As you can see, the impetus for this came from this side of the House. Clayton Cosgrove deserves credit for that, for pushing the minister into actually including retention scheme in the bill in the first place. And so it is worthy of note, and I congratulate him for that. These 3 bills before us today, changes to 20 pieces of legislation, all administered by MB. They're fixing regulatory gaps, errors, compliance issues, generally updating parts of the law, including the Companies Act, the Commerce Act, the Construction Contracts Act, as I've mentioned, the Financial Markets Conduct Act, the Employment Relations Act, and the Unit Titles Act. And there are others, but those are the main ones. I just want to touch on a couple of other issues. One is also in the Commercial Matters Act, relates to the financial reporting for small New Zealand branches. The changes that small New Zealand branches of large overseas companies. And we accept the logic of this change. We accept the way it's, the arguments that were put to us by officials who took the trouble to go away and come back with a lot more information about why this was necessary and the anomalies that currently existed that were where you've got a large overseas company and they've got a small branch in New Zealand, and yet they had an auditing requirement. You also then had subsidiaries of large overseas companies that didn't have an auditing requirement, and so there was a concern that it was potentially going to create a chilling effect for large overseas companies to not set up small branches in New Zealand. And so I don't think we've got any issue around the fact that this change means that these small branches don't have to fulfil an auditing requirement. The questions, though, that were asked were around what was the definition of a large overseas company, and I still have a bit of a niggle around this. It's something that may need to be looked at a bit further down the track, but that is that the definition for a large overseas company is one that has annual revenue of $10 million or more and total assets of $20 million more, which has been set at 1/3 of the amounts for defining a large New Zealand company, which is $30 million annual revenue and $60 million in total assets. And so what that means, there is a discrepancy in that definition, which I am still not convinced that I understand the rationale for that, and also around the transparency and accountability. If they're not being audited, how is transparency being afforded? So there are still a few little niggling questions around that. With regards, just a comment with regard to the Building and Housing part or Act bill that we've got before us today. In the committee stage of the discussion, a number of things came to light around what were considered to be changes that were being recommended by submitters, which were considered to be out of scope by the officials because they related, and we were given an explanation in the House by the Minister and the Chair at the time, Michael Woodhouse, who said that this was an omnibus bill. It was a step above a statute amendment bill. Therefore, it didn't deal with matters of substance and policy matters, and that was why matters were considered to be out of scope. We know that there's a wider review going on into the Unit Titles Act, but it seemed inconsistent for that minister to be saying that when this bill does consider matters of policy, it does consider matters of substance in other parts of the bill, and I've got a concern around the timing. That some of these changes did seem to be inconsistent. They were accepted on the one hand, but not on the other, because they were considered to be out of scope. As to how those matters are going to be dealt with, and I would like, and clearly this is not the committee stage, but I'm putting it on the table that there are many outstanding matters from this bills that haven't been dealt with yet, that relate to wider issues of policy, and I guess it's just a trademark of this government that it does stuff around the edges and often doesn't deal with the really substantive issues that it should be dealing with that really matter to the people of New Zealand. So we support these pieces of legislation. As you can see, we have had quite a lot of impact and have driven a lot of the changes, and particularly around the amendment to the Construction Contracts Act. It's important that it does pass so that this retention scheme can come into effect on the 31st of March, because the trust, the contracts entered into or renewed after that date this new retention scheme will apply to, and that's important for our construction industry.
I call Andrew Bailey.